welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming bright and early on a Monday morning to the beautiful Museum of Liverpool in the beautiful city of Liverpool. It's the view across the river when it's sunny is absolutely fantastic. Do enjoy whilst you're here. My name's Ashwin Kumar. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at the Institute for Public Policy Research. And today we're going to be talking about living standards. When you look at some of the polling evidence, it's one of the issues that kind of always comes top of the public's concerns. And so one of the questions is, therefore, what should we be doing about it from a public policy point of view? And there are various ways in which you can think about this question. You can think about it in terms of people's income, particularly their earnings. You can think about it in terms of the support provided by the social security system. Or you can think about it in terms of government action to control costs, the costs that people face. So that's what we're going to be debating today. We do actually have 4 great speakers today, but our last two, Claire Moriarty and Luke Murphy, MP, are so keen that are already doing one event this morning and will be joining us slightly late. But we're very lucky. So I'll introduce, first of all, Graham Downey, who is one of the founders of the Living Standards Coalition, and he is the Member of Parliament for Dunfermline and Dollar. You were elected in 2024, yeah. And since then you are chair of the APPG on Parkinson's, and have made a particular issue of raising what happens to people in the benefit system in universal credit when they have fluctuating conditions, which of course it's terrible at dealing with. And then very pleased to welcome Megan. Megan Kenyon is a political correspondent at the New Statesman, a political commentator regularly on a range of media, including the New Statesman podcast. Yeah. Right, we're going to start off with hearing from Graham, if that's all right.
Thank you very much, and thanks to IPPR for the invitation this morning. I think it's a good way to frame it. How do we come at this problem? So I'll talk very briefly about, in a moment, about some of the kind of policy interventions and where the Living Standards Coalition idea came from. But I think to a slightly cynical extent, a lot of my thinking about this comes from a fairly brutal political analysis. Fundamentally, my belief is that this Labour government will have been thought to have succeeded or not succeeded over the next few years based on whether or not people feel like they are better off than they were in 2024. I don't think that's a particularly radical concept, but fundamentally we need to make sure that we're focusing on putting more money in people's pockets, bringing bills down and making people feel like their lives are better and hopefully making them actually better as we go along. In America, there's always discussion of, there's a gas and groceries election, the prices that we see every day. In the UK, it's fuel, it's food, and it's energy costs. Those, to me, are the 3 things that people they see visually. You see the price in the fuel pump as you go by. You know how much your shopping's costing, and you know how much your electricity bill's costing. So those are the 3 things, as well as having a huge impact on living standards themselves, have a huge impact on how people feel about the government, how people feel about their lives, and how people feel about what the priorities are. So the Living Standards Coalition was an idea that came from a fairly broad group, small group of us inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, including Luke, who'll join us shortly. And really that was it, is how do we get a really good supportive group, a cross-section, a really broad section of the Parliamentary Labour Party to support this government in delivering solutions that really focus on those kind of priorities. How do we make sure that the government has a constructive approach and policies brought from the outside through a grouping who is seeking to be helpful and bring them into implementation by this Labour government? And if you look at the people who are involved in the Living Standards Coalition, it really is all the different parts of the party. Because if there's one thing I think every Labour MP and every person across the Labour movement can agree on, it's that we're here to make people's lives better. Those who are most in need in particular are the ones that we want to support. So you will have seen through some of the press, we've already had interventions on areas such as energy costs and how do we start bringing those down for people, realising that quite a lot of the factors, frankly, are outside our control, or some of the things being done at the moment are quite long-term. Some of the infrastructure upgrades you're seeing that will over time stabilise prices, the investment in renewables and in nuclear. But are there measures that we can bring forward now that actually will have a more short-term impact. Similarly, on something like fuel prices, which is something that actually we have a particular problem in my own constituency, where despite being a city in Scotland, very close to Edinburgh, Glasgow and other places, fuel prices in Dunfermline are actually much higher than they are even 3 or 4 miles down the road. I've also got a large rural part of my constituency, so with fairly poor public transport, so I'm very aware that even small changes in fuel costs or transport costs have a massive impact on those villages. And people really, you go around the doors in some of the old mining villages that I have in my constituency, it is, 1 or 2 pence in fuel prices really has a massive impact on their ability to reach work, to reach education opportunities, and is actually slowly, in some cases, sadly, draining these villages of people as they move even into Dunfermline or broader. So those kind of costs that impact different parts of my constituency and others are a huge long-term trend, as well as being a short-term issue that we have to tackle. And finally, I think on food prices, again, we see campaigns over the last year by farming communities where they are, I can understand their perspective very clearly. They're not entirely happy, it's fair to say, with this Labour government. However, the conversations I have locally with farmers, we're not their biggest problem, and we're not the thing that actually angers them the most, despite some of the rhetoric we see on the telly. The thing that angers them the most is they don't feel that they're being paid fairly. And how do we, so we have food prices, this is their view. Their food prices are artificially low. Farmers are the ones getting, frankly, screwed over. Partly true. But equally, we don't want to make sure we're raising food prices in a way that then affects poverty in those areas as well by raising food prices. So it's always a balance. But I think for me, those are the 3 specific areas on living standards and costs that I think we need to tackle from a political perspective, as well as from a public policy perspective for the short term, as well as building through for the long term. So very keen to hear what other panels have to say, as well as questions from the audience about how we go about doing that, and if there's issues that the Living Standards Coalition can pick up in Parliament and try and press through to government as well, to have the kind of impact that I think we all want to see to bring down poverty, as well as improve living standards more broadly, helping our electoral prospects as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham. Megan, should I turn to you now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone showing up at 9 a.m, the early slot. Thanks for having me, IPPR. Yeah, I guess I'm going to come at this from the perspective of a journalist covering this. I think living standards sort of time and again came up before the election and are coming up now as a sense of, Labour have to fix this in order to get elected at the next election. But equally, I think after 14 years of austerity, people are sort of, really feeling the pinch and kind of getting to a point where they really want to see proper change. I think Labour has been so on this. I think they've done some good things so far. I think particularly in energy, actually, there seems to be a really positive vision. And Ed Miliband, sort of literally hit the ground running as soon as he got into power, lifting the ban on onshore wind. But I think that what really needs to improve is probably the communication of it. I think that, a lot of the time Labour are actually doing some good stuff. There was the Workers' Rights Bill, which I think is a really positive piece of legislation, which once Angela Rayner resigned, there were some question marks over it. But I think it's those kind of things where, it's not necessarily the most glamorous, shiny piece of policy that actually, by sort of communicating that far better with the public, I think Labour would have a better chance at the next election. I think also we've seen, earlier this year when the steelworks at Scunthorpe kind of, when the government had to debate whether to bring it into public ownership, I think there was a real conversation there about, it says, one of the questions IPPR asked us to address was about left behind communities. And I think there are several former industrial communities, including Scunthorpe, even though that conversation was about, top level, talking about steel and kind of critical infrastructure. I think there was a wider conversation that could have been had there about how do we really take care of these communities that are going through those transitions. And I think Labour had a great sort of, was very willing to discuss this before the election, but I think since then we've seen sort of them take their foot off the gas a little bit. But yeah, I think the Living Standards Coalition, I remember I covered you guys when you founded, I think is a really fascinating sort of group within the party, because as you said, it sort of brings together a lot of different traditions within Labour. And I think some of the interventions you guys have done already, specifically on energy bills, you know, it's that how do we change things in a really tight fiscal climate without having to sort of put undue pressure on Rachel Reeves to do something that she's probably going to be quite unlikely to do. So I think it's sort of, I think it has to be the guiding mission of the Labour government, but I think that there are certainly some brilliant things going on already. But I would just say, from a perspective of covering it, it would be far better to sort of push forward some of the good things that Labour are doing, and I don't necessarily think they're doing that right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Okay, and now we turn to Claire. Dame Claire Moriarty, who is the Chief Executive of Citizens Advice, and for 35 years you were a civil servant, including as Permanent Secretary of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and for the Department for Exiting the EU. And Citizens Advice, of course, is an organisation that sees millions of people every year. And one of the things I've always been impressed with Citizens Advice is how carefully you analyse the data of who comes to see you and the problems that people are facing up to when they come for advice to you. But Claire.
Thank you very much, Ashwin. Really good to be here, particularly on such a beautiful sunny day. So I come at this from the perspective, as Ashwin says, of the people who we see, and we do collect a lot of data, and we're really interested in understanding that. So, you know, we see millions of people each year who are struggling with living standards. In August alone, our frontline advisors helped over 200,000 people with cost of living issues, broadly drawn, that goes from crisis support, rent payments, bill support. And there are, you know, and we know, and people already talked about some of the kind of specific drivers of those. Obviously, you know, energy is a big issue, housing, I'm sure we'll come back to. But one of the things we've looked at over the last few years is what does that add up to overall? And we talk a lot about negative budgets. And in the simplest terms, so negative budgets are when people's income does not cover their essential outgoings. So when somebody comes to us for debt advice, we start by trying to do everything we can to maximise their income. And then we go through a process with them that's called a standardised financial statement. So that's kind of industry-agreed amounts of what people should be spending. So it has nothing to do with how well people are budgeting. It is a standardised process. When I joined Citizens Advice in 2021, about 37% of people who came for debt advice were in a negative budget. That rose in the course of 2022, 2023, and to about 50%, and it's sat at about 50% ever since. So half of all the people who come to us for debt advice, when we've done everything we can for them, are in a position where their income doesn't meet their essential outgoings, and they are going to be getting further into debt every month. And what we're also seeing at the moment is that the levels of debt that people have are continuing to rise, even though some of the specific pressures have eased a bit. So, I mean, just to give you an example, so Caroline initially came to us for support in 2019, had significant mental and physical health problems, unable to work. And when she came to us, she'd had a tricky period with her health that resulted in her becoming unemployed. And we helped her work through a whole kind of range of issues, getting the benefits she was entitled to, moving into more suitable private rented accommodation, getting a debt relief order to clear her debts. But what's happened over the last few years of kind of, you know, relentlessly rising costs, her benefits have increasingly been unable to cover her essentials. And she came back to us this year in a negative budget and with several new debts. And so, you know, our advisors went through the same process of trying to kind of maximise income and address outgoings, but she is still in nearly £150 deficit every month. So if every month that goes past, she is having to, she's running up more debt. And it is, that is the problem that people are facing in living standards. It's not just, things feel uncomfortable, but actually people are being trapped in a cycle of debt, and the longer you stay in it, the harder it is to get out. And we, at Citizens Advice, we pride ourselves in taking a holistic approach to people, seeing people as people, helping them address the range of issues that they may be experiencing. But it's not something that we can tackle alone. And I think the thing I particularly like to draw attention to is the need for more joined up support. As a recovering civil servant, I'm really conscious that that's not the way that government is set up. Government is aligned in departments which look at particular sectors, and they look at people's lives as they interact with a particular sector. What we see as Citizens Advice is people as people with all of those, everything going on around them. And we see that a decision that one department might make has got knock-on effects for people that aren't seen by that department because it doesn't turn up in their space. So you freeze local housing allowance, that's going to turn up in more people needing discretionary housing payments. And all it does a lot of the time is just move money around the system rather than addressing the issue. So there are a few things that we would really like to see being addressed in order to have a more kind of sustainable, resilient solution to living standards. Data sharing, there is stuff that could be done to make more automated people's access to the support that they can get. So social tariffs on key bills without having to keep going through lots of different processes, find lots of different evidence, reproduce it, which we know for many people just acts as a deterrent. If there's a lot of other stuff going on in your life, the headspace that you've got to deal with this is really limited. And so there is some good evidence of how government can match up data which it holds in different parts of its brain in order to, for example, make sure that people get warm home discount, but not enough of that's happening. There are some encouraging cross-government initiatives like the Child Poverty Strategy, which has provided an opportunity to look at some of these issues across departments. We led some of the engagement work, particularly looking at the cost side of child poverty, and it was really interesting getting government departments in a room, and they were realising as they talked to each other that some of there are gaps in some of their policies. So the one that always stuck in my mind was if you look at Healthy Start, so Healthy Start for children. So there's a scheme that runs up to children's 4th birthday, and then once they're in school, they can access free school meals. But actually, there's a gap for children between their 4th birthday and when they start school, which can be up to a year, when they just fall down a crack because two different government policies don't talk to each other. And then there's some work going on at the moment on a financial inclusion strategy, which again, commendably, the government have brought organisations like us into some of the thinking about that. But again, the tendency of government is to break things up into boxes. So there are 6 strands of the Financial Inclusion Committee, so access to banking, access to insurance, problem debt, financial capability. But what we see is that the same people who are struggling with access to credit are also struggling with access to insurance because they haven't got the money to pay for it. They're also struggling with problem debt. And so that sense of understanding what it is like to be on the receiving end of every department's policy and struggling with all of these issues, it just feels like that is where there needs to be more focus. And we really hope that the government will use the forthcoming budget and the child poverty strategy to try and look at these things in the round and turn the tide on living standards.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. So we've had a really clear account of kind of what some of the issues are. There was a request from Graham about sort of recommendations for solutions. But there are some big challenges. We heard about the fiscal environment. For instance, a couple of years ago, the previous Conservative government introduced energy bill support, but that came at quite a high fiscal cost. So to what extent are we able to address some of these problems within a constrained constrained fiscal environment with limits on public spending by improving the way existing systems work? Or is it about government spending money in particular areas? And if so, should that be supporting the bills themselves through social tariffs or energy bill support, or should it be through general intervention in the social security system? And for instance, Megan, you were talking about, for instance, the criticality of the work, of the availability of work. Is that a route, or does that take too long, really, to have the impact that we want to see on people? So a few sort of prompts for you. I'm going to hand it over to you now. Who would like to ask a question? And when Luke arrives, we'll get him to say a few words. Of course, he won't have heard any of the previous debate. So, you can see if you can trip him up in some way. But over to you now. Who would like to ask a question? Okay. The lady in the front row? To just wait for the mic. Sorry. And just also say who you are and if you're from an organisation.
Claire Smart from the Forest of Dean CLP. And it's less of a question about how we tackle it, but more really playing to what you said, Megan, around the communications. And I know that, for instance, we've got a situation where fear of crime and the concept or the perception that crime is increasing and actually crime's going down. And I guess we not only have to fix the problem, but we also have to fix the perception, because we could not quite easily, but we could put a lot of work and time into fixing this, and actually living standards could increase. And yet people could still, for some reason, perceive that they haven't. And I think do we think it's two tasks? One is to change perception, and one is actually to change reality.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple more. There's a lady in the middle.
It's Lucy Hooper from Step Change Debt Charity. I'd like to echo everything Claire has said as well. Debt advice sector's facing huge challenges. We're seeing more people on negative budgets, more complex debts as well, pushing more people into poverty. And I just wondered, perhaps something for Graham, whether the Living Standards Coalition, that's something they could look at as part of their work. Debt advice sector, particularly with the financial inclusion strategy that's coming up. We're concerned about that, and how debt advice needs to be a big part of that. That's a big opportunity to kind of look at the challenges we're facing.
Okay, thank you. And a third question, over here at the front.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Katie. I'm from Utility Warehouse, which bundles utilities and saves customers money by doing so. I'm really interested to hear about the Living Standards Coalition, and I wanted to ask Graham, what specific solutions are you exploring at the moment when it comes to improving living standards for people, and what role are you looking for from business in supporting that?
Okay, thank you. So we've got three questions. We've got about the communications, debt advice, and about the Living Standards Coalition and businesses. So who would like to, do you want to go first, Graham?
Yeah, I'll try and answer a couple of these quickly. I think first, to Claire's point on communications, it is both. I think we have to do. I wrote a piece earlier on the year. My background's working in communications and public affairs and PR, and I don't think it's a secret to say that this government has not got all of that right. Don't think that's going to be any kind of surprise. I think what the government has up to this point not done as effectively as it could have is have a clear narrative about what it is doing and what the purpose of it is. And I think my perspective is that something like living standards or making people's lives better should be more of an overarching narrative than perhaps it's been up to this point, because in some ways you can then you can put sometimes the difficult decisions that we do have to take can be put under a banner. Yes, we're doing this, but it's to do this. And I think that's where we've maybe not done that effectively. And it's something I've been fairly critical of the government on publicly as well. I think there are some signs that might be changing, and I hope it is. But I think there's a balance to be struck. I think there's a culture moment if you tell people that, oh, we're coming to help you, fundamentally at the moment they don't believe us. And I think that is an absolute fundamental base point. The things that they will believe, even if there was suddenly oodles of money around and we could have a huge intervention along the lines of supporting energy bills, I think even if we did that, the public response wouldn't be thank you. It would be, where have you been all these years? I don't think we would get necessarily credit for that directly. So that's why it has to be part of a bigger narrative rather than just a sequence of things that we have to do. And I think that what we can do as Living Standards Coalition is provide some of the solutions, but I think it's also on us to provide some of the narrative that goes around that as well. I think, Lucy, I think the broader debt point, I think is a really important one. When I was a councillor, one of the things we saw really clearly was The people that had previously had government support were able to access it more easily. The people that we were really worried about were the ones who were just slipping into it, didn't know necessarily that they were going to be in difficulty. They couldn't see what was coming 6 months down the line. And by the time then support got to them, it was not so much too late, but it was much, much harder than it could have been. And getting to those people with advice before they're in lots of trouble, they're the one, you know, and trying to help them, kind of prevention being better than cure. And I think some of the other things that Kate was asking about, what we're looking at, I think it's issues like childcare and things like that. I think we need to look at as well. And I think that's something that we're going to be looking at down the line. I think there is a role for businesses there too, because I think, you know, as was highlighted earlier, there are not going to be funds available for large fiscal interventions. I think the Chancellor's made that really clear, and I think she's absolutely right. And again, even if there were, I'm not entirely sure that just a single solution is going to solve either the real problem, or, to go back to Claire's point, the perceived problem either. This has to be a programme of work that goes through and really filters into every single thing we do. So when we talk about, for example, the Employment Rights Bill, for me, we need to tie that much more into talking about this will help with living standards, this will help you pay the bills. And again, back to communications, but I don't think we've done that effectively enough. We've almost taken it as given that people think this is a good thing. And people do support it, but we've not said that this is what it's part of. And I think we need to do much more of that. I think the government's done a lot of good things. Again, I wrote a bit on this a while back because I was getting frustrated at the people not listening. This government has done a whole range of good things. Part of it, just looking at it, is that they've taken a lot of money from, or not necessarily supported older generations. And my view is we should be taking that and going, let's not hide and say we are helping younger people. And by that I mean people under 45, 50. But we're helping them not get into debt. We're helping them and supporting them to do more. And I think we should be much more clear, but that's why we're doing it and what we're doing. Because I think that kind of narrative could be really powerful. And I think we just need to be not quite as shy about saying that, about explaining our motivations.
Okay, thank you. Claire, Megan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting questions. Just some reflections. So I think the point about perception and reality, really important. The slight spin on it, I think I would put, is that there's kind of living standards for the many and living standards for the few. And I think what we've seen in some areas, so there is a commitment to kind of raise living standards. But what we've seen in some policy areas is that, for example, some of the changes to a combination of universal credit and other benefits, is that you can improve a lot of people's situation by a small amount, and then have a really big negative impact on other people. So that question about what is it that people are perceiving is I know it's really important, but it's quite nuanced. I mean, debt advice, obviously, I mean, we are at Citizens Advice very interested in debt advice. I think, I mean, the important thing to remember, fundamentally, debt advice is failure demand. So, the reason why people are in debt or need debt advice is because they're in debt. I think if you go back, I don't know, 15, 20 years, a lot of debt was, it was financial services, it was credit cards, and so on. What increasingly, the debt that we see in the moment, it's utilities. Debt is arising. It's fuel. So it's energy bills, energy debt. It's water debt, housing arrears, and debts to the government, which is a whole other interesting question. But the underlying reasons why people are getting into debt is to do with that broad canvas of living standards and what's available to people. So very, very much underlying the point, it's much harder to help people the later it is. So the more that can be done, both in terms of getting the policies right in the first place, but also getting help to people at an earlier stage. If we can help somebody get somebody into the right position so they've got finances that balance, that is always going to be better where we can. And then I think the other point, that targeted interventions is really important, particularly in an environment of fiscal constraint, making sure that money goes to the people who most need it. You can do a lot more. You can have a lot more bang for buck with a given amount of money if it's well targeted, and that's where things like data matching and data sharing and making sure that we are identifying the people who are in the greatest need, who may not be identically lined up with people on means-tested benefits. That tends to be the default group because the government has names, addresses and bank details. But actually we know that in things like energy, poverty, there are a lot of people who are experiencing problems who are not on means-tested benefits, and it's very difficult without some more sophisticated thinking about data sharing to get the support to the right people.
Okay, thank you. Megan?
Yeah, just wanted to answer the question on perception. There is sort of a debate that's been going on Twitter, or X now, about London, and people seem to kind of talk about, I mean, I guess it comes from sort of more right-wing accounts of how London's so terrible now, line bikes everywhere, it's so dirty, it's kind of, so dangerous, whatever. But actually others have sort of said, well, no, London's still fun, it's still the same city that I love. But I think that to me is such the crux of the issue, is that so much of this stuff gets whipped up kind of online and also politically. And actually I think the job of government, as well as actually improving living standards, is, I think, ensuring that in doing so you've got a really good and strong community cohesion narrative, because I think what we're seeing at the moment with kind of the rise of reform, people are very dissatisfied in the country, and if you leave that gap open, it's so easy to tap into it. So I think, it was with things like kind of cutting the winter fuel payment, I think the government could have pointed to the fact that actually there is the Warm Homes discount. So, it's not as if, well, I mean, that did sort of backfire, but I think it's about sort of doing that narrative of, okay, we're in government, we're making really difficult choices, but actually we're building a country that you should want to live in. And I think it's really important to have that narrative, as well as sort of being honest with the public, because otherwise it just sort of leaves open that gap for more toxic and polemical debates to kind of feed into.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I'm now going to introduce Luke Murphy. Luke is the MP for Basingstoke, elected in 2024, and also with Graham, a founder member of the Living Standards Coalition. We've been talking about kind of what the policy priorities should be to tackle kind of living standards, the context of fiscal constraints, how effective the government's communications are, and kind of what they're communicating in terms of the narrative they're talking about on living standards. We talked about debt advice, and then also about the coalition and its role. Do you want to say a few words, and then we'll kind of go to questions? Yeah. Luke.
Thanks, and thank you for having me, and congratulations to IPPR as ever on having a fantastic programme and one of the best venues at conference. So I mean, I think Graham's introduced the kind of coalition. I mean, in terms of the issue, we know we've faced stagnating living standards for 14 years. This will be if not the defining issue, I think, for the government, about whether it can tackle and improve people's material cost of living. That's why the coalition is so important. And I think the challenge, and I've just come from another event on this. The challenge is, I think, as you've already identified, is we are in a fiscally constrained position, but also I think we need to be thinking about this with a kind of majoritarian perspective, because it's not just people just at the lower income spectrum, although they are obviously feeling it most acute. We do need to think about people that are facing it in the lower to middle income, because this crisis of living standards, of cost of living, does reach up further up the income spectrum. So I think the government does need to, and we need to be balancing, ensuring absolutely we are providing for support for those most in need on the lowest incomes, but we do also need to find a way to make sure that we're improving the material kind of living standards and cost of living with people further up the income spectrum. So there is a balance to be had there. I think, of course, it's very easy, I think, there was a slight danger in the conversation I was just in with ELSEF, which was focused on energy bills, where the conversation almost defaulted to, well, how much can the Treasury afford, as if that was the only answer, and that isn't the only answer. Of course, it plays a role. But for example, in the energy market, which is the area I know most about, there are lots of reforms we could be thinking about that could benefit consumers. Some of it is more techie and you wouldn't necessarily be kind of leading a conversation on the doorstep on, but about driving down network costs, making sure that we're rolling out flexibility so people can take advantage of having more renewables on the grid. That literally could, I know I've met a company the other day who was saving £800 a year on energy bills through their model of flexibility. So there needs to be a reform agenda as well as a thinking about what the government can afford to support if Rachel, and that's an if, obviously is able to find fiscal space to support. Again, on energy beyond flex, there's things like breaking the link between the gas price and the electricity price, because one of the reasons why our energy prices, for example, are so high is because it's linked to gas. It's not because of renewables, as Reform and the Conservatives would have you believe. I think that the last thing I'd say, just obviously in this segment, is I think whatever the government does, it has to be highly visible. People have to notice. I think there's lessons to be learned from our Australian counterparts, where they were literally receiving checks in the post, and people really noticed that. I think the government needs to be quite bold in that. I think amongst everything that goes on, I think just an amount that comes off someone's bill, whatever it might be, understandably, people don't actually pay that much attention. So it needs to be done in a really visible way and have a really clear line through to the government has done it, and this is how and why you're benefiting. We live in kind of quite a, simplistic political kind of messages, and I think we need to be, so coming to that communications point, everything the government does needs to be really driven home and really clear to people that it is the government action that is delivering that change, whether it's on energy or whether it's on transport or other areas that the coalition will be focused on.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. Right, another round of questions. Who'd like to go next? There's a lady just in the middle here.
Good morning. I'm Rachel Gregory from WPI Economics. I was interested on your list, Gavin, one of your 3 didn't include rent, which for many people is the biggest single cost they're facing each month. And I think at the moment the private rented sector is a really scary place to be in terms of cost, some of the competition in some areas and quality. I actually live in the north where housing costs are far cheaper than lots of the other country, but even so, if you can move into social rented housing, if you can get on the property ladder, you're looking at your housing costs halving each month. So I was just interested in the panel's views on what are some of the things that we can do in the short to near term that are going to help people feel better off in rented sector.
Okay, so rent, that's a really good question. Who would like to go next? There's a gentleman right around the other side, sorry, I'm making you, in the white shirt just over, just in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, Chris Todd, Transport Action Network. It's been a little bit disappointing just to hear about fuel duty and nothing about public transport. In the north, there's over 3 million people at risk, high risk of social-related social exclusion. And it is a critical issue. Labour's doing some good things around rail renationalisation, for example, but a lot of public support is predicated on cheaper rail fares, not just on that renationalisation, because they won't see many of the benefits. And isn't this really about smarter choices? Because it's not just about money in your pocket, it's also about life chances. People in many areas, young people, for example, aren't going to benefit by fuel duty cuts. They need public transport, they need safe ways of moving around. And that is not being addressed. And the government has just bunged nearly £1 billion at the Lower Thames crossing, for example, where there are 250,000 households in Kent and Essex who have no access to a car. They cannot get across the river to join up the housing with the jobs on the other side. And these sorts of things are not being actually, in fact, they're actually being made worse by the government. But these are opportunities if we can turn that around and start focusing on what actually makes a difference. So what can be done more to make more of the joined up government happen? Because when Labour came into power, it was talking about mission-driven government, joining up all the different silos, but it doesn't seem to be doing that right now.
Okay, thank you. And one more. There's a lady right at the back in the middle.
Hi, Jess, Citizens UK. I think any conversation about living standards and bringing down poverty needs to recognise the really high costs for people who don't have citizenship, whether that's through children who can't get access to child benefit because their families have no recourse to public funds, or whether that's the cost of citizenship itself, of many families kind of being pushed into debt to pay for it. So I guess my question is, how do we champion citizenship as a way to improve living standards for many of the families in poverty? And how do we make sure that children who don't have citizenship are part of a conversation on living standards?
Okay, thank you. So we've got 3 questions, one on rent, one on transport, and one on particularly on non-citizens. Who would like to? You wanted to talk about rent.
I'll pick up 2 of those and probably the third to others. I think on rent and housing, and actually on transport as well, I'd kind of slightly not covered them, to be honest, just because it's devolved in Scotland, and so it's a bit different. But I think your point on rent and housing costs is absolutely right. I mean, we've seen I can talk about how bad it can get, and that we've seen the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, cut their affordable housing budget by 1/3, and then wonder why that their self-declared housing emergency isn't being solved. They've carried out reforms to the private rented sector, which has had the only effect it's had is driving rents up, without, because they're not enforcing existing rules effectively enough. So you've seen an absolute shift in the PRS of, frankly, good landlords leaving, and leaving the ones who don't follow any rules hanging around and ripping off customers left, right and centre. And because fundamentally you've had a lack of investment for the last 20 years in social housing, in council housing, there have been huge cuts to council budgets. You have a huge shortage of all types of supply. You have still people living in council houses in my constituencies that are 4 bedrooms for 1 person. There's no mechanism to help people move around and move out the system at all. If you speak to any of my team, as well as when I was a councillor, the most heartbreaking and horrible bits of casework we get in are anything around housing, because the honest answer to reply to them all is there just isn't enough housing. It's not in the right place. You're forcing people into the private rented sector who, frankly, shouldn't be in the private rented sector, who are, as a result, living in conditions that are not appropriate for them. You're seeing council, this is where I'm about to be slightly possibly get myself into trouble, but one of the things I've seen certainly in Fife is where, to be honest, councils as landlords are not held to a high standard at all. If it's a council housing, it's deemed to be good by default. The state of the council housing I've got, again, in the mining areas I was talking about before, these houses have been there for 70 years. They are literally having foundations washed away, mold growing everywhere, families breaking up as a result, the stress and everything else that comes with, feeding into so many other social problems. Sorry, you can tell I go on a bit of a rant about this constantly. I don't think there is a short-term solution at all. The solution is you need to have a very honest conversation with individuals and say, sorry, that house you're in is too big. We need to find a way to incentivize you to move to something else. And we need to start freeing up both in the rented market and in the and in the house purchase market about actually what people have got. We have not been willing to have that conversation in Scotland. I think it's one that England probably does need to have, and fairly promptly, because otherwise things just get worse. And yeah, I think to pick briefly up on the public transport point, again, as I mentioned in my introduction remarks, I've got a rural constituency where access to public transport is appalling. It is, there is buses that go east to west, but none that go north to south to link up the villages that I've got in my constituency. It is subsidised in some areas by the council. The costs are going up and up and up. So there's one Lifeline bus route that I've got that basically goes round a few of the villages. The cost of that service has gone up by 35% in the last 3 years. And the council are struggling to find the money to subsidise it.
Megan, do you want to come in?
Yeah. On the rent question, I think that we've found ourselves in a position where, so essentially the whole housing market has kind of shifted upwards. So we have basically in London, I think there's 1 in 50 children lives in temporary accommodation, but we've run out of the temporary accommodation that would basically, we don't have enough flats or houses to house people in, so people are ending up in B&Bs and hotels. But because that sort of lower end of temporary accommodation is full up, that means that the whole market has sort of shifted upwards, which then makes the rent higher for everybody else. So, you know, where someone would maybe have rented on the low level of the market, that's now being used for temporary accommodation, which obviously means that you'll go for a more expensive property. So in my view, I think the best way to fix this is by really focusing on social house building, because we have a severe lack of social housing, and that is the most important supply that we need to put back into the market. I also think that on rents, obviously the government's doing their renters reform bill ending Section 21, but I think that there maybe needs to be a more serious conversation about rent controls. I mean, Scotland has rent controls. It hasn't necessarily gone amazingly well.
It doesn't have rent controls.
Oh, it doesn't?
No, we've got rent control zones. They've never been implemented.
Oh, okay,
so no, it doesn't have rent controls.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Scotland's having a discussion about rent controls. Doesn't have rent controls. That was fake news for me. Sorry. But I think that's what we maybe should be seeing in England, is having a wider discussion about, okay, we can't keep coming back to supply as the sort of be-all and end-all to this question. I think on the life chances question, that's sort of what you were saying about that all feeds in. And I think Labour came in with this mission-driven government approach. Obviously, we've seen a few moves. I mean, Georgia Gould was moved out of the Cabinet Office. She was kind of leading that. She had been at Camden and been very successful working with Mariana Mazzucato in doing that in Camden. I think it's interesting that those moves have happened, because I think, you know, I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying that the missions actually are so important in terms of not necessarily selling them to the public, but the government, basically the civil servants, knowing, okay, we have this mission to deliver this. And also I think it kind of gave the, put a big onus on having Join Up, and I think that's what you're sort of saying about the life chances thing is, you know, if you don't have a safe and secure property, if you don't have good access to public transport, that does affect life chances in the long run. And so having Join Up across all of those areas, I think was what the missions were sort of helping to do. And I think it's kind of weird to me that the government seems to have stepped away from that, when actually that if it had been stuck to for the long term, probably would have had its desired effect.
Okay, thanks. Megan, Luke, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things. I think on the citizenship point, I mean, I have difficult conversations with some constituents who, you know, have said how difficult it has been for them, and some of the repeated charges they have to pay through the NHS surcharge. And I think it is difficult, it is tricky, but I think there is a thing around making and it is making a higher contribution in order to earn that citizenship. And I think that in a fiscally, in a world where we had a lot of money, I think that might be something where the government would look to ease it. But in truth, like, take the NHS surcharge, for example, that has provided an enormous amount of money and revenue for the NHS, which we otherwise wouldn't have had. So I think that's a difficult conversation, but I don't foresee that changing. And that is the conversation I have with some of my constituents in my surgeries. I think on housing, I think the big challenge is supply. And I understand what you're saying. We can't keep coming back to supply, but in a sense, we've been having a conversation about needing to build more homes, but without actually building more homes. So we actually need to try the supply thing, as well as making sure there's enough affordable housing out there, as well as ensuring that when you're in private rented accommodation, what is now kind of quite a landmark bill on renters' rights, ensuring you've got more control over your home and over the, you know, we need to be in a position. I remember when Grant Shapps became housing minister for the Conservatives in 2010, where he talked about the idea that wages needed to, year on year, exceed housing costs, increases in house prices, and that's what we need over a sustained period where wages are regularly going up higher than rents and increases and house prices. On transport, just very quickly, I think it's a bit unfair to say the government isn't, the government is doing a lot of work on this. The bus services bill, bringing back buses back under public control for areas that would like it. Andy Burnham has been doing a great job with Long May It Continue, continuing as the Mayor of Manchester on the B network, which is an example of what can be done with those powers, and the government has brought forward the bill to do that. We've got the £3 bus fare cap, which I'm fully supportive of and would like to see that continued, and more people travel by bus than they do by rail. I think we've got to have an honest conversation about what public service rail coming into public ownership is and isn't going to deliver. And I think Heidi and the government have been clear that it's not going to deliver dramatic falls in rail fares, but it should result in a fairer and more reliable service. And I think that's the commitment on that. And then on buses, it's about increasing accessibility, making sure that people in rural areas, obviously the bus services bill is for England only, people in rural areas in England can have greater access to the bus services and that they're more affordable as well.
Claire,
I'll be brief because I don't want to repeat things that people have said. So on rent, I mean, as others have said, renters, proper implementation of the Renters' Rights Bill, really important, and building social housing, incredibly important, because that is definitely puts people in a better position. But it's not going to happen soon enough for the people that we're seeing. Rent is really driving the negative budgets I was talking about. Often the one of the single biggest elements of people's the out of kilterness of people's budgets is that local housing allowance does not cover their rent. So local housing allowance, as it over time drifts away from even the notional 30th percentile of the market, so people can quite easily be paying £150 on top of their, beyond their local housing allowance. Now, there are all sorts of problematic consequences of increasing local housing allowance because of the way it interacts with the rents that landlords demand. But actually, just saying we're going to build more social housing, and in the meantime, we're going to leave the local housing allowance arrangement as it is. That is what is driving huge amounts of problems for people and leading to people losing their homes. So we're seeing 400 people a day with homelessness issues, and we've seen nearly 70% increase in people needing help with temporary accommodation issues, and temporary accommodation, whole other problem. We've just put a report out about the hidden cost of homelessness and all of those extra costs, the sort of things that Megan was talking about. On public transport, Chris, lovely to see you. I think public transport is a really good example of that, the need for the joined up thinking that I was talking about earlier. When we did our sessions on costs for the child poverty strategy, public transport came up quite a lot because it's great that there's a £3 cap on bus fares, but if there isn't a bus service, then the £3 cap doesn't get you anywhere. And and if people are thinking about how can they access work, if you don't have a car, if you can't afford to run a car, then you need to be able to use public transport. It's like childcare. It's a hidden barrier to people being able to access employment. So it is a really significant issue. And interestingly, one of the other things that came up in that discussion was about the costs for people on with no recourse to public funds of visas. I think I'd need to check, but it's something like it averages out at about £5,000 a year just for visa costs. For a family of four, you have to renew your visas every so many years, and that's £5,000 that you've got to find from your available income just to pay the cost of visas.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Let's come back for another round of questions. The gentleman here at the front who's had a hand up.
Hi, my name's Peter McLeod. I'm a pollster and opinion researcher. Thank you very much for the panel. On this topic, I think one of the biggest traps that a government can fall into, certainly the Conservatives fell into it, and another government I've worked with in another country fell into it, is kind of on the opposite side to most of what we've been talking about, which is that when your macroeconomic figures show that living standards are rising, there is a great temptation for the government to fall into kind of complacency and triumphalism. So you can have macroeconomic figures showing that wages are rising faster than inflation, over a period maybe of 6 months or a year. and you'll want to be out there trumpeting that as a great achievement. The challenge being that most people, even under those circumstances, still feel that things are a great challenge for them. They feel like prices are going up and they're facing bigger and bigger costs every month, and you have a great danger of seeming totally out of sync with people. And I'm wondering if the panel's got any thoughts on how you avoid falling into that trap.
Okay, thank you for that. Who else would like to ask a question? There's somebody at the back in the middle of the back row.
Hi, my name's Martha. I'm from the Living Wage Foundation. I was just wondering, we talked about the Employment Rights Bill and I guess a very strong legislative floor on like minimum wage in this country. Are the Living Standards Coalition thinking about people who are self-employed and the potential to fall into bogus self-employment as a result of people trying to avoid the Employment Rights Bill, and also like the slow creep of the gig economy into sectors like social care, childcare, etc.?
Okay, thank you. And one more. Gentleman over here on this side. First question from this side of the room. Apologies if you're feeling ignored.
Hopefully I'll do us proud. I'm Sam. I'm from the anti-poverty charity Z2K. I just wanted to ask about what role the panel thinks that social security has to play in terms of driving living standards. We heard about how the tackling living standards needs to be sort of a majoritarian issue, and we don't need to just focus on those in the lowest incomes, but we also know that when it comes to like tackling poverty, often social security measures are the most powerful intervention. So like scrapping the two-child limit being a kind of good example of that. So yeah, be really interested to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've got 3 questions. One is about how macroeconomic data, particularly average wage growth, for instance, might be hiding kind of people's real experience and sort of the risk of falling into a trap of kind of trumpeting those macroeconomic figures and not really realising what people's real experience is. The issue of people who are self-employed and therefore not receiving some of the protections that the government has put in place, and then the role of social security. Who would like to? Luke, you've gone in.
Very briefly, on social security, absolutely. I think the government's got the child poverty strategy. Very keen to see the results of that. I'm speaking to lots of people across conference who are talking about the very lengthy and also quite expansive consultation and engagement that's had been part of that. I was at an event last night where Torsten Bell, the Treasury Minister, was saying that this government, this Labour government, like every other Labour government, will oversee and drive down child poverty, and I think I and other MPs will certainly be holding the government to account on that. So yeah, of course it has a vital role to play. I think on the question of self-employment, I mean, without discussing it with, I think we have to be probably honest as a coalition. It doesn't mean individuals can't work on things, but about what we've got a core set of things that we are working on. That doesn't mean what the self-employment issue and what people falling out of the Employment Rights Bill or kind of falling through loopholes isn't important. But at the moment, we kind of have a set number of things around energy, around transport, around childcare that we're focused on, because that's where we feel we can make the most difference. But that doesn't mean that individual MPs or wider groups of MPs wouldn't want to engage on that and understand it and see what we can do. So just kind of get in touch on that. And on the final point, I think you're right, and I think the answer is that really visible thing that I mentioned earlier, like the check through the post, what the Australians did, so people can see what the government's doing without over-claiming about, but being clear that there's still more to do to help people. So being really clear how the government is helping, but not over-claiming through macro data about appearing triumphant, because it's you're not going to undo the nearly 20 years of stagnating wages in 1, 2, 3 years. It's going to be a thing. So just showing that you're on people's side, but making clear that there's more to do.
Claire.
Really, really interesting questions. So I think, I mean, the point about kind of declaring victory too soon on living standards or anything else, I mean, that is something that we are really interested in through the, so I chair the UK Finance Consumer Advisory Group, and we would meet every 3 months, and kind of in the early stages of the cost of living crisis, every 3 months they would come along and say, well, our data shows that there aren't any real problems, and we and Step Change and others will be going, no, really, really, there are lots and lots of very big problems. And we spent some time trying to work out whether there was kind of one side was right or wrong, and the reality is that I mean, it's a combination of people get lost in the data, and particularly when you've got groups who are really very disadvantaged, but but when you're looking at data for the whole country, or 9 million people who've got mortgages, you can't necessarily see the people who are in real distress. There's also an issue there, actually, of people who are in the most distress don't show up in those sorts of numbers because they haven't got the mortgages. But actually, my take out from that is you always have to look at the data and really understand what it's telling you, and look behind the headline numbers. The other thing is, I mean, again, 2022 was the year of the cost of living crisis. Our numbers show that through the whole of 2023, the problems were still getting worse. Through the whole of 2024, our numbers in terms of the people coming to us with cost of living issues, they have possibly peaked now in 2025, but the amount of debt that people have is still rising. And so, I mean, some of it is the data is out there. So my message to government would be to pay attention to the people who are seeing the problems, and seeing the problems in pockets that aren't necessarily going to show up in your broader data. And your point about social security, I mean, I would say that as Citizens Advice, we recognise, there is a majoritarian point, but actually, the people who we see are the people who are in the most difficult circumstances, and those are so difficult that we have to, big general solutions just don't touch the sides of the issues that people have. And social security, we have to look at work, wages, social security all together, but social security is a big part of the problems that people have. Anyway, I'm going to call it out. The base rate of universal credit is not enough for people to live on, and that is to some extent a design choice, that it's designed as a benefit that people bounce into and bounce out of, and therefore it is supposed to give you enough to put your food on the table, but not enough to replace the pair of shoes when they wear out. But actually, that's not people's experience of how it works in practice. So, and that the inadequacy of the level of universal credit, coupled with things like local housing allowance, is that those are the issues that are trapping people into poverty, and then making it harder for them to find the headspace that would enable them to move out and find work. So there is a nexus of issues that all need to be looked at together. It is difficult in an environment of fiscal constraint, but you can spend so much time trying to save the money that it ends up causing bigger problems elsewhere that then cost more money to fix. You come back to it's more expensive to solve problems when they turn up later in the system. And I'm not a big expert on self-employment, but I think we're certainly very aware that there are some specific issues for people who are self-employed, and some of the solutions that look fantastic, sometimes they just don't apply to people who are self-employed, so you end up again creating pockets of people who are being particularly disadvantaged.
Okay.
Yeah, on the macroeconomic question, I guess it kind of speaks to what we've been talking about today, which is that wages may be going up, but house renting costs are going up, energy bills are going up. I think it's about sort of fixing the problem as a whole, and then not focusing too much. Obviously, wages are incredibly important, but the cost of living crisis encompasses so much more than that. On the social security question, I think in my reporting, I feel like a big question looming over this conference is about the two-child benefit cap. And I think there's been a lot of pressure kind of mounting on the Prime Minister to sort of do something about that. Obviously, the child poverty strategy is coming out later in the autumn. But I think things looking at sort of more imaginative solutions, I think it was IPPR that came up with the gambling tax. I think in the New Statesman published a guest edited edition by Gordon Brown where we sort of went into that a bit. And I mean, lifting the two-child benefit cap, I think it's estimated to lift 470,000 children out of poverty. So I think that, I was literally in a taxi yesterday on my way from the station to my hotel, and the taxi driver was saying, "Oh, do you think they're going to lift it at this conference?" It's the kind of thing that really, really matters to people. And he was sort of saying, I have 2 kids. My third child was born the day after this policy came in. So it's one of those things that it's got such cut through because it affects people's lives, and obviously their children as well. So I think, it'll be really interesting to see what the government does on that. But I think looking at the imaginative solutions like the gambling tax, I think, could be a good way of doing it.
Okay, thanks. Graham.
Thanks. I'll try not to repeat some of the points. I think, first of all, just on the gambling tax, I'd given Gordon Brown lives about 15 minutes along the road from me. And being a Scottish MP and a Fife MP in particular, I make it a policy never to disagree with Gordon Brown. Otherwise, I'm liable to get a phone call or an email at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I was one of the MPs who actually signed that letter that you were referring to around the gambling tax. And it's looking about, are there solutions we can play with? I think equally what we've got to be really careful of is not pretending there's a silver bullet for any of these problems. That, right, okay, let's say the government decide to lift the two-child cap, we cannot consider that job done. I think we've got to be really careful to politically fall into that temptation, and that's why I think the point that Luke was making about that wider child poverty task force is really important, no matter what happens, because governments have this, we do have this habit of going, oh, we've done that, what's next? And not realising some of the impacts as well. I think on that kind of macroeconomic point, I think that was heavily criticised Joe Biden's campaign, essentially of battering people and telling them that things were better and people not feeling it. And fun of the people, whereas Donald Trump's response was to talk about the cost of eggs. And I think that highlights perfectly, and again, it comes back to the point where we're discussing a lot of communications. It's incumbent on us as MPs, as other organisations, to listen to the stories as well as to the macroeconomic data. And I think equally, when we're then saying things back, we've got to tell stories about improvement without stretching it too far. And I think the narrative I think any first-term government probably wants to play at the end is so much done, so much more to do. And I think if you can think of that as a frame, I don't think anyone's suggesting that we can solve all of these problems quickly or immediately. And the issues we've talked about this morning have certainly been some of the trickiest and stickiest that I think any government's going to come across. But if we can start telling stories of improvement and making sure, look, it is getting a little bit better. We're not saying we're there yet, but it is getting a little bit better. I think the point on self-employment is a really good one. It's again, I've got a lot of self-employed businesses in my constituency and spoken to the Federation of Small Businesses locally as well. It's something that I'm actually, oddly, it was part of the stuff that I'm doing around fuel costs in Dunfermline, quite a local campaign, came from self-employed businesses as well, who feel a bit left out, frankly, of some of the changes. I think it's a really fair point. I'd be keen to pick up on some of that if there's specific things that can be done.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Maybe one last question from anybody? Gentleman over here. Do we have a mic? Great, thanks, Emma.
No pressure.
Yeah, thank you. Andy Bates, Bermondsey CLP. So we've got a food bank. It's got a lovely, friendly first room where we give out food. And then there's a much bigger room where there's welfare rights advisors, a whole bank of welfare rights advisors. And I just kind of wonder how we've created a welfare state that needs a bank of welfare rights advisors, that needs 200,000 people to go and see the CAB in August, how we've kind of created something that's this complicated and whether we can simplify it again.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really great question perhaps to end and to ask you to answer that question, but also perhaps to sum up any concluding thoughts you have to bring this to a conclusion. But the question was about kind of how have we arrived at a system where that's the kind of way in which we support people to be able to cope with the pressures which they face. But so if you'd like to, who'd like to go first? And
well, I'm happy to go first. As I don't know if it's true of your particular food bank. Well, a lot of food banks, it is citizens advisors who are in food banks, and that is both it's both a great thing and a not great thing. I mean, it's a great thing because we need to, advice can make a huge difference to people's lives, and getting advice to people in the environments where they are is really powerful. And so we work really closely with Trussell Trust in particular, because they recognise that getting upstream of people's problems, getting advice to them is the way to, the shared objective is that the next lot, you might come to the food bank this time, but the next lot of food that you get comes from the supermarket, not the food bank. So it's a really good example of how you can put services together and give, respond to people's lives and help them. Equally, as you say, it's, you know, we don't want to be there. We don't want to be in a position where people are getting to that point of crisis, of needing, you know, not being able to put food on the table, of going to the food bank and then trying to give them advice and stick the pieces back together again. So we have 3 missions, and one of our missions is about early intervention and trying to get away from supporting people in crisis and back towards prevention. So how do we spot an earlier stage, people who might end up in that position? How do we get advice to them earlier? But I mean, ideally, how do policies change so that people are not in the level of destitution that leads to them needing a food bank? So I think it's a really, really important thing to hold on to, and that is, you know, the government is committed to ending mass dependence on emergency food aid. How is that going to happen? And, you know, hopefully the child poverty strategy, you know, will be the vehicle through some of that happens, but, you know, unless it includes abolition of the 2-child limit, you know, the numbers are pretty stark, and the government is going to get to the end of the Parliament with more children in poverty than when it came. That is not, I know that's not where the government wants to be. So addressing some of those issues, and I think, you know, driving through on some of the really positive things that are happening. We've talked about the Renters Reform Bill, we've talked about the employment rights, you know, really addressing those issues and putting the systems in place to support people, having the right policies there. And then I guess I just end on my starting point about joining things up. So really trying to think about people as people, and not solving one little problem over there only to have it pop up or be exacerbated over there.
Okay, Megan, do you want to have a go at this question and any concluding thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of what Claire has said. I think it's sort of the nature of our political cycle that we kind of look for quite short-term solutions, but also, you know, short-term actions, that actually we've sort of lost sight of the fact that we need to have a longer-term, more whole-person view. I think the cutting of, you know, I think public health budgets at councils have been cut sort of by 25% since about 2015. So it's those kinds of services that often are deprioritised because they're not flashy, they're not the kind of thing that you can sort of get kudos for putting on a leaflet, but actually they're really vitally important. So I think it's about taking, you know, taking a step back and sort of looking at where do we want the country to be? Do we want the country to have, you know, food banks and multi-banks, as Gordon Brown does a lot of work on? So yeah, I think there's a lot for the government to do, but I think they can do it. There's definitely things they can do to do it. I don't feel like, often it's really easy in these conversations to feel it's all doom and gloom, but it is hopeful. I think things will change, so yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Megan. Graham, do you want to come next with both an answer to the question and any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think Megan nicked my other way of mentioning Gordon Brown and his multi-banks, which I know was David Tennant is now fronting as well. But I think that's a fantastic kind of project that Gordon started in Fife and is now rolling out in different places across the country. I think on the specific question, I think there's a lot of reasons why we've ended up in this position. We've explored some of them today, but I think there is in any community setting, having someone who can have a preventative voice is going to be valuable, whether that's welfare checks that can be done, or the work that Citizens Advice do across the UK. I think one of the reasons that I think you find them now in food bank settings or other settings like that is because that's where people go. So certainly again, where I am, we've had a lot of council cuts because of budgets. The community centres aren't there anymore, are not accessed as much anymore. So that kind of preventative or early intervention work is being done in the places where people are. And sadly, that is at food banks. I mean, the food bank in Dunfermline that I visited a couple of weeks ago for the third or fourth time since the election is now working a lot with refugees that are coming to the area to make sure they're getting the right support and indeed protection from some of the rogue landlords that we discussed earlier on as well. I think some of the overall discussions, I think it's all been incredibly helpful and certainly given us lots of things that we know we need to try and tackle. And again, it's how do we balance the short-term, long-term and the perception reality? I think that's the kind of themes for me that have kind of kind of come out. And I think we all want to do things right away. We all want to try and make things better right away. And there's things we need to make sure we're looking to do that. But what we've got to make sure we've always got an eye to the future as well, and the reality of the situation we're in, where sadly a lot of the threats we face and a lot of the changes that could come down the line could be outside our control, as we saw in the past. And that's something we're always going to have to be ready with short-term measures, but we've got to make sure that we're tackling those systemic problems as well. But thank you very much to everyone for coming along with some fantastic questions.
Okay, and finally, Luke, do you want to...
I mean, I agree with everything Graham said what I was going to say, pretty much. I mean, very quickly on, I mean, this is kind of speaks slightly to your point, but you know, some of the best volunteering in my constituency happens around food banks, and it's incredible, like the lengths to which, and the operations people have set up locally in terms of the food delivery, the collection. It's incredible, but none of it should exist. And I would like to get to a point whereby it doesn't exist. But I take the point also around why it is that's where people are finding their welfare support and access to the security system. I think just to Graham's point, I think overall, I think the point Graham made earlier about there not being one silver bullet, yes, we need to be focused on social security, that's absolutely vital, and what the child poverty strategy might bring forward in terms of individual measures, whether that's the 2-child benefit cap or anything else. But I think we need to be thinking about it as a systems view. We need to make sure that everything that we're doing, all the decisions we're taking, are focused on materially improving people's living standards and addressing the cost of living. So, and it's not just focused on reliance on the Treasury, because we're not, as I think as Graham said, there are circumstances outside our control which mean that is going to be fiscally unaffordable. But what we can do is be absolutely ruthless in the energy market to see where are the greater efficiencies we can make in the system. How can we make, in some cases, there might be profiteering in different parts of the energy, housing, whatever system, part of the system we might be talking about, and be absolutely ruthless in focusing on that, as well as ensuring that we're doing things like legislating for good work to ensure that we have a more productive economy, which means we're growing more, but also that people are able to, you know, take home a good wage as a result of the work they're doing. So we need to be thinking about work, we need to be thinking about energy, we need to be thinking about housing, doing it in a really systemic way, while also ensuring that we have a really strong social security net to support those who will never be able to work, or those that have fallen on hard times and need support back into work for however long. So I think it is that systems point of view. And lastly, to Graham's point, the other thing that's come out is being really clear that there's always going to be more to do. Show that we've made progress. Show that the government needs to be doing things in the short term to show that we are on their side and that we get it. And that we don't just kind of over-celebrate, but like we're on their side, we're taking short-term actions, but then build the trust that they know the government is working in the longer term in a more systemic way to transform the economy in their interests.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and thank you all. Can we thank all of our panelists for a really great discussion? And we have lots more IPPR events. There are flyers just outside with the rest of our programme, but thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
Taste of a sweet